I have a mixed bag of feelings and thoughts around mental health diagnoses. I detest almost all of them for many reasons, which are probably too much for this podcast episode alone, like how utterly subjective they are and how pretty much anyone can fit into some kind of diagnosis. These are major problems. But in this episode, I'll focus on how a diagnosis, whether from a licensed expert or a self-diagnosis, may be part of the problem that a therapy client is seeking help for in the first place. Hi, I'm Justin Sinceri, and this is Stuck Not Broken. I'm really glad you're here with me. Welcome. This is not therapy or life advice, by the way. Oh, and I am a therapist and a coach. So I'm bringing a lot of my own personal experience when it comes to working with clients to this. We'll do a thought experiment, though, and we'll imagine two clients. The first client, Penny, comes to therapy because she's feeling heavy, not finding enjoyment in things she used to enjoy. She lacks energy. She has thoughts of self-harm, and she spends a lot of time alone. The second client, Milton, comes to therapy for the exact same reasons. Feeling heavy, not finding enjoyment in things he used to enjoy, lacking energy, has thoughts of self-harm, and spends a lot of time alone. Penny and Milton are both desperate for change. They are both serious about therapy, and they both think that something's wrong with them. They keep thinking, I wish I were normal. They long to be like other people who seem to have everything together. And they both assume that they're going to receive a diagnosis and finally get an answer to why they are the way that they are. The difference between Milton and Penny lies in who they see for therapy, in the diagnosis that they receive and what they can do with that information. It's a big difference. Penny's therapist hears Penny's presenting problems in history and labels Penny with the words major depressive disorder. Penny's therapist believes she has a mental disorder. And Penny believes her therapist because, after all, the therapist is the expert. Penny's therapist tells her she's going to need to manage this mental health disorder probably for the rest of her life. She should probably get on medication soon, and they review a list of coping skills that anyone could probably find on the internet with a simple search. Penny asks, how did I get this way? And the therapist mutters something about brain chemicals, or some people are just simply born this way for some reason. Milton's therapist hears Milton's presenting problems in history and does not label Milton. Milton is shocked. He protests to his therapist, but I feel heavy. I don't find enjoyment in things I used to enjoy. I lack energy. I have thoughts of self-harm, and I spend a lot of time alone. Milton's therapist responds, right, that's all true. Those are a list of some of your experiences. We can acknowledge those and we can normalize them. They make sense based on your life context, the events, the people, the things in your life. Would you agree with that? If somebody else had your life and lived through what you've lived through and were still dealing with the things that you're dealing with, they would also likely live with the heaviness and the lack of enjoyment and whatnot, right? And so Milton says, if someone else had my life, yeah, probably. But what diagnosis do I have? What's my problem? What's my mental illness? Milton's therapist smiles. I understand what you're asking. And if you want me to give you a label, I'm sure we could find a couple of labels. But then what? What do you do with that label? Milton says, well, then I would have an answer for why I am the way that I am. Would you, though? His therapist responds. What would that tell you? That I'm depressed. That there's something wrong with me. Milton's therapist explains that a diagnosis is a label for a set of behaviors and thoughts that often occur together. These labels are contained in a book called the DSM. The labels in the DSM book were created by a committee that voted on what should or should not be included. Labels can come and go and have come and gone based on cultural tides. And there's no explanation within this book of why someone would have the collection of behaviors and thoughts and feelings. The book only says that they do have them and then gives them a label. The DSM collects these things and gives them a name, a label. That's really it. The therapist says, if I gave you a diagnosis, it's not like I'm extracting your brain chemicals or blood and doing a test and then diagnosing you. I'm not doing x-rays or anything. No MRIs, no CT scans. There's no test in that way. It's just me giving you a label based on what you're telling me. And if you went to another therapist, they would also just give you a label. And there's a really good chance that it would be a different one than me, or maybe they would give you the same one as me or a different one, and then another label on top of it, like ADHD, which pretty much everyone who comes into my office seems to have these days. Okay, so fine. What's wrong with me then? Milton asks. What's wrong with you? Says the therapist. Nothing's wrong with you. I'm not here for no reason, Milton says. And the therapist says, of course not. You're here because of heaviness and thoughts of death and lack of energy. I get it. But nothing's wrong with you. I think there are things you'd like to change. Yeah, sure. You're not happy with your life at all. You don't want to have those thoughts and feelings. I get it. And I'm glad you're here and we can work on that. But as we agreed before, the things that you're here for are a normal and expected result of your life context. And anybody else would probably live with the same experiences if they had your life, right? Milton says, yeah, so when he's of course he's unsure of what to do with that information. Well, since we know what you're going through and we know it makes sense you're going through it, let's give you permission to have these experiences. Let's not fight it. Let's pay attention to it. Pay attention to it, but then I'll spiral out of control and these things will get even worse. Yeah, probably if we did nothing different, your experiences would get worse. The therapist agrees. So let's do things differently. Well, differently how? Asks Milton. The therapist says, if I asked you right now to pay attention to your feelings, it would probably be too much. So I won't do that. But we know what your feelings are already, and we know that they're normal based on your life context. We agreed on that. So let's give them permission to be there. Let's not reject them. Milton cautiously agrees. Now I'll take things in a different direction. Instead of rejecting your emotions and your feelings and your thoughts, let's let them be there, and I'll ask you, how are you breathing? Milton shrugs and says he's breathing normally. The therapist asks, okay, but are you breathing into your chest or your belly? Is it full or is it shallow? Is it tense or is it relaxed? Milton says he's breathing into his belly. It's shallow with some tension. The therapist leads Milton through a really simple practice, paying attention to what he sees outside the window, what he hears in the immediate space in the room, and checking his breath again. After a few minutes of this really simple mindfulness practice, Milton notices that his breath feels fuller and more relaxed, and it's still into his belly. His belly is expanding. He feels more grounded than he was before and than he has in a long time. Do you remember when I said we need to give your feelings permission to be? That we should pay attention to them instead of rejecting them? And Milton does indeed confirm he remembers that. Right now, In this moment, as you feel this level of connection, are you open to paying attention to your other feelings, the ones that bring you here? Milton says that, yeah, he is. The therapist helps him identify where the heaviness lives in the body. Milton says it feels heavy all over, like he's being pulled down, just weighted down. It's a very lonely existence, he says, like he's in a dark cave and no one will bother even looking his direction. The therapist leads Milton, again, through connecting with the world around him, looking out the window, listening to the world around him, or at least in the little room, checking his breath. So how's that heavy feeling now? Milton says it's still there, but less. And he has a puzzled look on his face. This is different. The therapist says, do you see how this works? And Milton nods. He's kind of getting it. We don't reject how we feel. We don't try to banish or get rid of it. We acknowledge our experiences and we balance them with connecting to the present moment. I get it, says Milton. I think it's going to take practice, but I get it. This is different. Yeah, it definitely takes practice. We're never quite done with it, the therapist says. There is some benefit to using simple skills like this to reduce the uncomfortable feelings, but there's a bigger benefit when you use these skills proactively, on purpose, like part of a daily ritual maybe. We can take this little practice that we did here and we can extend it, we can deepen it. But we'll hold off on that for today. Let's go back to the question of a diagnosis. Yeah, you probably meet the criteria to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So what? What does that do? Milton says, I thought it would give me an answer, but maybe not so much. So I don't have a chemical imbalance, a serotonin, something or other, a dopamine, this or that. The therapist says, I have no idea. I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that I meet with many, many people who come into this very office, sit where you sit, for the same reasons as you and other ones. And I can give them the same diagnosis. When these clients begin to pay attention to the present moment, though, and to their emotions, even the uncomfortable ones, things tend to change, to get better. Of course, I can't guarantee that. And if you really want to talk with a psychiatrist about it, I'm happy to connect you with someone that I think acts very ethically and isn't quick to just dispense medication after talking with you for 15 minutes. Okay, dear listener, we'll stop our little story here. Obviously, I'm giving you two very different examples on purpose. I'm trying to illustrate something. Penny's example leans much more toward like a negative experience, right? And to you might be, well, that's extreme. That's obviously just concocted, but it's really not. This is Penny's is a very, very realistic expectation or reflection of therapy in 2026. I hear it from clients all the time. Milton's example is a very realistic reflection of very common dialogues between clients and me. I had this same conversation with someone just a couple of days ago. Of course, there's a huge gray area, and there are tons of therapists out there who can label and still provide great treatment. I hope you have one, or I hope that you are one. But let's focus on the differences between Penny and Milton and try to focus on especially the diagnosis part of it. A diagnosis is a shorthand way of expressing a cluster of behaviors or thoughts or emotions. It's professional, quasi-medical terminology intended for professionals to use amongst themselves. That's really it, even though diagnosis and our understanding of it has ballooned into something else entirely, especially in non-professional settings. But essentially, since the first DSM in 1952, its purpose has been to create a shared language among professionals. For example, imagine I had to talk to a colleague without having a label, a diagnostic label. I would say, hey, therapeutic colleague, I need to consult about a client who has excessive anxiety and worry about a variety of topics, events, or activities that occurs more often than not for at least 6 months and is clearly excessive, and the worry is experienced as very challenging to control, and the anxiety and worry are accompanied by edginess, tiring easily, and impaired concentration. Huh. That is a lot to say, right? So instead of saying all that, I would just say, hey, therapeutic colleague, I need to consult about a client who meets the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. Much simpler, right? I wouldn't say with a client who has generalized anxiety disorder, I would say they meet the criteria for it. So, diagnosis is a label, a naming device for professionals, not an explanation. Diagnoses carry almost no explanatory power. PTSD might be the exception, at least the one that comes to mind right now. They focus on the presenting concerns that commonly occur together and then group them under a label. That's a diagnosis. Diagnoses also lack foresight. They can't tell what's going to happen next. For example, in Penny's case, she would be labeled as depressed, major depressive disorder probably, and that's kind of it. But in Milton's case, the therapist is looking through a much different lens. That therapist does not see Milton as having a mental illness or a mental virus or an affliction or a disorder of any kind. He sees Milton, first off, as a result of his life context, but also in the present moment, he sees Milton through a lens of the nervous system. And he can anticipate Milton's current needs and what will come next. As somebody in Milton's state recovers, which is probably a collapsed shutdown state, they will likely experience increased mobility. So that therapist will be able to work with Milton to monitor any increased mobilization, to normalize it, and even encourage it in productive ways. Milton's therapist will recognize when mobilization shows up in a regulated and unregulated way, and then adjust the homework and the treatment plan along with Milton. Milton's therapist will recognize irritation, for example, as a positive sign, and will know that Milton needs to focus probably a little bit more on safety practices or those present moment practices to balance the irritation, and also work with Milton on an avenue for his irritation, like more physical movements or creative outlets. But all of what's happening within Milton is understood and expected. Penny's therapist will look at the irritation and think things are maybe getting worse. They will encourage Penny to cope through distraction as a way to get their mind off of irritating things, or maybe encourage Penny to think more positively, or do a gratitude journal, or something. Penny's therapist can't anticipate what the next phase of change is going to look like. That therapist will only add friction to the process of recovery because they only see Penny as the diagnosis. Another issue regarding and a non-temporary diagnosis. But another issue regarding diagnosis is its impact on the client. Penny got her answer, and that's kind of it. They'll do some coping and management skills and talk about the week over and over. Maybe they'll discuss childhood and family issues. But Penny and her therapist will forever look at this as an affliction that Penny has, something to manage, something affecting Penny. Milton and his therapist have a different view. They see Milton's presenting problems as temporary. Instead of merely coping and managing, this therapist, who is again looking through a nervous system lens, is going to address Milton's underlying baseline state and help him shift it through proactive skills. There's much more hope in Milton's scenario. Penny believes something's wrong with her. She'll leave therapy with the belief that she is inherently depressed. She will feel the heaviness and sadness and isolate herself, and she'll say, "This is my depression again." She'll reject those experiences. She'll wish for them to go away. She'll shame herself for not getting better, not being normal, and maybe forever be stuck in her state. I know this sounds like the extreme, but it's not. You might be living with this today. Milton believes he's temporarily in this state. He'll leave therapy with a new way of understanding himself and with more hope that things can change. When he feels the heaviness and the sadness and when he wants to isolate himself, he still won't like it, but he's more likely to be curious about it and not reject it. He's more likely to balance these experiences with present moment mindfulness and other skills he'll learn through therapy. He's less likely to reject his experiences, more likely to embrace them and balance them out. And as he does, he'll begin to make changes at a deep nervous system level, and he and his therapist will know what comes next. Milton and his therapist will find ways that Milton can proactively improve his presenting problems, not only reactively manage them, but they could do that too. So look, I don't know you, dear listener, and I don't know your diagnosis. They're not all equal. Things like depression and anxiety, ADHD, OCD, panic, PTSD, these are very treatable because the underlying nervous system state is very changeable. Someone who's diagnosed with ADHD, for example, can eventually get to a place where that diagnosis is no longer relevant. It doesn't have to be a lifelong label. Same with depression, same with anxiety, and on and on. I'm not telling you to disregard your diagnosis. It plays a role, but it's not limiting. I hope you don't view it that way. It's just a label. The word is a label. The experiences you have are real. It's okay to acknowledge that and to treat it with respect. And your current experiences probably make sense in light of present and past context. It's okay to acknowledge and to respect that as well. But change is possible. And it starts maybe with curiosity, being a little bit more curious, not with a label, not an answer that someone else gives you. Curiosity about your own experience and what your nervous system might be trying to tell you. But just like discard the nervous system framework. You don't even need that. Your emotions that you're struggling with aren't just things in your brain, right? You feel them. You feel them in your body. Or at least if you're paying attention enough, you do. A lot of times we're not aware of what's happening from the neck down. So if you can, try and be a bit more curious about what's happening in your body. Where are your emotions showing up? Where's the tension held? Where do you feel heaviness? What does your body need? Does it need quiet, or does it need lowered lights? Does it need sunlight and space maybe? A diagnosis labels where you are. It was never meant to tell you who you are or what your potential is now or in the future. I'm inviting you to rethink what a diagnosis is and the role that it plays in your life. And if you're a provider, someone who has the power to label, I invite you to rethink how you're thinking about diagnosing and how that affects what you think your client's potential for change is. I'm not making this stuff up. This is exactly what I do for a living with my clients in therapy. They come in and they easily meet the criteria for this and that and the other thing. Some want a diagnosis, some don't. Regardless, change is possible, and we don't lose sight of that. There are many, many ways to spend more time on this stuff at all price points, from the free mindful moment get-togethers that I host virtually, to my books, to working with me one-on-one. Every option that I have to deepen your learning and your practice is listed at stucknotbroken.com/start. stucknotbroken.com/start. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode. Bye. This and other content I create is not therapy, not intended to be therapy or be a replacement for therapy. Nothing in this creates or indicates a therapeutic relationship. Please consult with your therapist or seek for one in your area if you are experiencing mental health symptoms. Nothing should be construed to be specific life advice. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only.